So Tess Stanton with the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. And I was going to tell everybody too, these slides that I'm showing, I'm using multicolored squares at the top of every slide as a border. And it's part of the logo for the North Dakota Council on the Arts. And it's supposed to kind of show that we want the arts to be more than just one thing. There's so many different types of arts, and then we want it to help be accessible for all and affect all people. So that's why the different colors. Okay, so let me talk about Tess here. She is going to talk about the 2010 ADA law and what it means for organizations. Her presentation is titled An Introduction to 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design and Barrier Removal. She will discuss common barriers to facility access in existing facilities, some of the minimum accepted scoping and technical requirements for common elements, and practical solutions for barrier removal. So again, ask questions through the chat. We'll try to make time at the end. And again, thank you, Tess, for joining us. Do the drill where you do a little audio description and then fill in what I may have forgotten. So
that sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. So
yep.
Can you hear and see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And then can you see my presentation full screen, no speaker notes or preview of the next slide? It is full screen?
Yes, full screen.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and we'll go ahead and get started. My presentation is called Introduction to the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design and Barrier Removal. My name is Tess Stanton. I'm the training administrator at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, and I am a Caucasian woman. I have brown hair. I'm wearing a black turtleneck and a tan sweater over top of the turtleneck. I'm sitting in front of a filing cabinet and a window, so you may see some cars drive behind me. So before I dive into the content today, I have to give this disclaimer that information, materials, and/or technical assistance are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the ADA, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility under the ADA. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center, operated by Meeting the Challenge Incorporated, is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research to provide technical assistance, training, and materials to Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in other words, that disclaimer is just stating that we at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center are not lawyers, so we're not trying to give anyone legal advice, but rather we're an informational center here to educate on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So a little bit about where I come from, who we are at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and what we do. We are part of the ADA National Network, which is a series of centers throughout the United States that provide information on the Americans with Disabilities Act. The image on the presentation slide shows a map of the United States that's divided into different sections or regions, as we call them. I represent Region 8. So the Rocky Mountain ADA Center serves Region 8, which consists of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. So on the map, that's highlighted in a nice aqua color and labeled 8. And that's the region that the Rocky Mountain ADA Center serves. To get in touch with us, you can call 1-800-949-4232. And that's actually the number you can call to get in touch with any ADA center. So it's likely that most of my audience today is in North Dakota. But if you call that number, 1-800-949-4232, you'll be routed to your respective ADA center based on your phone number's area code. So even if you're coming at us from another state outside of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center's region, you still do have an ADA center, and you'll be routed to your respective ADA center by calling that number. You can also get in contact with your ADA center online by going to www.adata.org. So a bit about what we do. One of our main services is providing technical assistance. And what technical assistance is a person can call our center and ask a question about the ADA and their rights and responsibilities under the ADA. That's a free service. So should you ever have a question about, your business's responsibilities under the ADA, or if you're an individual with a disability, if you have questions about your rights under the ADA, you can call us and we can help you interpret what the law says. We also refer and network. So we're not an enforcement agency. We don't enforce the ADA. We just provide information on it. But there are other agencies that do enforce the ADA. So should you need that enforcement, should you need to file a complaint, we can refer you to those enforcement agencies. We also conduct research on different disability issues. We provide low-cost training, which is exactly what I'm doing today. So should you need training on the ADA, you can reach out to us. We publish and share materials. So we publish a blog called Access Granted. We also publish a podcast called Adventures in Accessibility. And we have a social media presence as well. So we're present on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, TikTok, and also Pinterest. So if you want to keep up with us on social media, you can connect with us, Rocky Mountain ADA Center, on most social media platforms. So again, I just want to reiterate, we're a really great resource should you ever have any questions on the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can give us a call or you can connect with us online. Now, a little bit about what the Americans with Disabilities Act is. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law, which means it's a legal guarantee for all citizens, regardless of identity and/or circumstances. It was signed into law on July 26, 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. It promises equal treatment for individuals in America in areas of public life, prohibits discrimination in state and local governments, public accommodations, so places that serve the public like restaurants, venues, retailers. We like to say that it's descriptive rather than prescriptive, meaning that it doesn't prescribe exactly what to do in every single situation because everyone experiences disability differently, but rather it describes generally what non-discrimination should look like. So the law very much needs to be applied in a case-by-case basis. That's why many times if you call us for technical assistance with a question about the ADA, our answer will likely start with the words, "it depends," because how the ADA is applied and the different regulations very much depend on the individual circumstances and the situations that where the ADA applies. So in that way, it is descriptive rather than prescriptive. There's no one size fits all solution when it comes to the ADA. Thank you so much, Kim, for putting our contact information in the chat. I appreciate that. And you set us up really nice, Ria, because I'm going to review the ADA definition of disability. Again, this is a broad definition and it's broad by design because the architects of the ADA didn't want people to really be closely scrutinizing and trying to nitpick what disability means, because again, everyone experiences disability so differently. It looks and feels different for everyone. So that's why this definition is broad. So the ADA definition of disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And the ADA also has protections that prohibit discrimination against those with a record of such an impairment. So that might be someone who had cancer but is in remission, but they still have that record of having cancer. It also prohibits discrimination against those regarded as having an impairment. So this might be someone who has scars, but they don't have, they're not substantially limited by those scars, but they're still treated as having a disability because of that appearance. The ADA also has protections against someone based on their association with a person with a known disability. So the ADA prohibits discrimination against someone who might not have a disability, but they may be discriminated against because of their association with someone with a known disability. This may be someone who works with others who have disabilities or has a family member who has a disability and may be discriminated against based on that association. The image here shows two people with their arms around each other. There's a woman with glasses and a man who has Down syndrome. In our learning objectives for today, we're going to understand the importance of physical accessibility and physical accessibility requirements. We'll overview the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, and we'll discuss common barriers to physical access and strategies for removing those barriers. The image on the screen shows people holding up big puzzle pieces, fitting them together. So just a little overview of the prevalence of disability in America. It's estimated that about 57 million people in the United States have disabilities, which equates to about 22.5% of the population. To break those numbers down a little further, 8.1 million people have difficulty seeing, 2 million people are blind or unable to see, 7.6 million people experience difficulty hearing, 31 million people have difficulty walking or climbing stairs. These numbers may look a little different based on the source that you're looking at, but just know that usually the reported numbers are about 20 to 25% of the American population are individuals with disabilities. And it's a high likelihood that that number is actually lower than the real number because some people don't report their disabilities or some people are underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed as having disabilities. So it's safe to assume that more people than we think have disabilities because also many disabilities are hidden, so they're not immediately obvious. So it's good to assume that on a day-to-day basis, you interact with someone with a disability. And Catherine says, is there supposed to be a presentation being shared now? I do not see it. Is everyone able to see my presentation? Okay. Let me go ahead and I will stop sharing and then I'll reshare. And we will see if that helps.
Still can't see it. Hashtag blind joke.
Fair enough. All right. Okay, is everyone able to see my presentation again? All right. Okay, hopefully that's visible for you, Catherine. So how do I ensure physical accessibility and what are the standards and requirements of physical accessibility under the ADA? Well, that's the question I'm hoping to answer today. So the standards for physical accessibility under the ADA can be found in this document titled the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. The image on the presentation slide shows the cover of the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, which in the background have washed out images of different measurements and dimensions of accessibility elements. It's published by the Department of Justice and it was published on September 15th, 2010. These standards are also commonly called the 2010 standards or just the ADA standards or just the standards. So know if you hear any of those terms, they're all referring to the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. These standards set the minimum requirements for qualifying facilities to be readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. So in other words, they set the standards for what facilities should look like at minimum to be accessible for people with disabilities. Again, it's important to understand that these standards are the minimum. So it's always a good idea to go even above and beyond what these standards require to create even more accessibility. But this is kind of like a baseline of physical accessibility. The standards were studied and scrutinized by the United States Access Board prior to adoption. And the standards do not serve as building code, but rather they serve as a physical representation of civil rights. So there are instances where building codes may differ from the standards, and in that case, you go with whatever standard or code provides the maximum accessibility or better accessibility. So there are 10 chapters to the 2010 standards that go really deep into the dimensions and the overall requirements of physical accessibilities for facilities. Chapter 1 covers application and administration, which is kind of like the rationale of the standards. Chapter 2 covers scoping requirements. So scoping is going to tell you how many elements you have to have and kind of the bigger picture of what accessibility looks like. And then the rest of the chapters, so chapters 3 through 10, kind of zoom in and tell you the exact dimensions and measurements and exactly what it looks like to make things accessible. So chapter 3 is called building blocks, and that's going to cover things like turning space, clear floor and ground space, reach ranges, kind of those foundational elements of accessibility. Chapter 4 is also a technical chapter. So again, that's going to really get into the specifics of dimensional requirements for accessibility. Chapter 4 covers accessible routes. So that's walking surfaces, doors, ramps, elevators. And I skipped ahead. So let's go back. Chapter 4 covers accessible routes. Oh, and I just covered that. So that's ramps, elevators, doors. Chapter 5 covers general site and building elements. So that's parking spaces, stairways, handrails. Chapter 6 covers plumbing elements and facilities. So things like drinking fountains, toilet and bathing rooms, urinals, and grab bars. Chapter 7 covers communication elements. So that's things like fire alarm systems, signs, and telephones. Chapter 8 covers special rooms, spaces, and elements. So that's things like wheelchair spaces and venues. That chapter 8 may be especially useful for you if you represent, a performing arts theater. Chapter 8 covers the dimensions and what the requirements for wheelchair spaces and companion seats. It also covers dressing, fitting, and locker rooms and residential dwelling units. Chapter 9 covers built-in elements. So that's like dining surfaces and benches and checkout aisles. And then finally, chapter 10 covers the technical requirements for recreation facilities. So amusement rides, boating facilities, exercise machines and equipment, etc. And the examples I gave for each chapter are not exhaustive. So these chapters cover a lot more than what I listed today, but this gives you an overview of all the things the chapters cover. So if you're interested in, making your restrooms accessible, you'd want to refer to chapter 6, for example. So what came before the 2010 standards? So the ADA was signed into law in the year 1990. The first iteration of the standards were published in 1991. And then the United States Department of Justice came back with a revised version of the standards, which they published in 2010. Now, use of that first iteration of the standards that were published in 1991 was permitted until March 15th, 2012. So there was a bit of an adjustment period. But come March 15th, 2012, the 2010 standards kind of became the law of the land. So these are the standards you should be using for any kind of new construction, alterations, any updates to your facilities, or any building of a new facility. The 2010 ADA standards should be used. And who must follow the standards? So any entities or facilities that fall under Title II or Title III of the ADA. Title II covers all programs, services, and activities of state and local government agencies, which are also called public entities. So here on the slide, we have a picture of the North Dakota Capitol. It's a concrete sign on green grass, and in the background, you can see the Capitol building, which is a very tall building with many floors and windows. That would be considered a Title II facility. And then Title III facilities are going to be private businesses, or in other words, public accommodations. So those are businesses that operate places that serve the general public. Examples of this, like I mentioned earlier, are restaurants, movie theaters, many venues are going to be Title III public accommodations, arts facilities, any private business that serves the public. And then Title III also covers commercial facilities, so factories, warehouses, and similar facilities that are not open to the general public but are commercial facilities. So those are the entities that must follow the standards. So it's likely that if you work for or represent a place that serves the public, you would fall under, Title II or Title III of the ADA. And now, so the ADA was signed into law in 1990, and then the standards were published in 2010. The currently used standards were published in 2010. So, what about buildings that predate the ADA? Do they have to follow the standards? The answer is yes, older buildings do have to follow the standards. So you may work for a historic facility or a historical venue. You still have to follow the standards. So all facilities that fall under Title II or Title III of the ADA should follow the standards no matter when they were built. Now there is a safe harbor provision. So like I mentioned, the first iteration of the standards was published in 1991. And then the newest and the currently used iteration of the standards was published in 2010. So if you're any elements within a building, so elements are things like water fountains, benches, bathrooms, just aspects of a building. So any elements built or altered before March 15th, 2012 that were built or altered to comply with the 1991 standards do not need to be changed to meet the 2010 standards until alterations or updates of those elements occur. So in other words, the Department of Justice doesn't want to punish people who once altered their facilities to comply with that first iteration of the standards by making them, re-alter their facilities to comply with the 2010 standards. However, if there's a building that was once altered to comply with the 1991 standards and they decide to renovate or do updates or completely demolish the building and rebuild it, then those 2010 standards are triggered and they have to come up to the 2010 standards. So in other words, grandfathering is not an existent concept of the ADA. So even if your facility was built before the ADA was signed into law, you are still have the responsibility to follow the standards. And where do the standards apply? So they apply to any new construction. So any new construction of a facility must comply with the 2010 standards. Alterations of existing facilities must comply with the 2010 standards to the maximum extent technically feasible. So it may be the case that your alterations, it's impossible to come up to the 2010 standards. That's why there's that maximum extent technically feasible exception in there. And then existing facilities. So facilities that aren't being altered but already exist should be brought up to the standards. And under Title II has to comply with the standards to provide program access. And then Title III facilities have to provide readily achievable barrier removal. So I'll explain what those terms mean. So Title II responsibility to provide program access means that a state or local government agency, also known as a public entity, may not deny the benefits of its programs, activities, and services to individuals with disabilities because of its facilities are physically inaccessible. So in other words, Title II facilities have the responsibility to comply with the standards and provide physical accessibility because they have to provide program access. So, taxpayers have to be able to use the facilities and participate in the programs that Title II entities provide. And then Title III facilities, so those public accommodations, places like restaurants, venues, movie theaters, performing arts theaters, places like that, have the obligation to provide readily achievable barrier removal. So this means that existing public accommodations are required to remove barriers only when it is readily achievable to do so. Readily achievable means easily accomplishable and able to be carried out with much difficulty or expense. So again, you're expected to comply with the standards where it is readily achievable to do so. However, it's always a good idea to consider, if something's not readily achievable, how can we provide accessibility? So again, the ADA standards kind of provide the minimum, but it's always good to go above and beyond and really scrutinize your facility and figure out, even if something isn't readily achievable, how can we provide alternatives, or how can we make it so that it is readily achievable? But the 2010 standards don't require that you tear down your facility, and completely rebuild it, right? So it does allow you to remove barriers only when it is readily achievable to do so. And the picture here shows 2 women with yellow hard hats on and construction vests, a yellow vest and a orange vest, high-fiving each other. I like to think that they just accomplished some readily achievable barrier removal. So where can you go to find the standards and to learn more? Let's say you're really interested in altering your facility to be compliant with the 2010 ADA standards. So all of these links that I'm about to describe to you are linked in the slide notes that I gave to Ria to distribute. I believe they're available on your website. So I believe the best place to find them is online on the U.S. Access Board's website. You can find them by searching ADA accessibility standards. I like the U.S. Access Board's online version because they link to the different sections of the standards. So it's common that when you're reading the standards, it will refer you to a different section to learn more. And all of the hyperlinks in the U.S. Access Board's publication of the ADA accessibility standards include hyperlinks to the different sections, so you can easily jump around the standards. The U.S. Access Board also provides a guide to the ADA accessibility standards. And that's just a more plain language version that gives guidance on how to execute the ADA standards and how to go even above and beyond the ADA standards to provide maximum accessibility. You can also find the ADA standards for accessible design on ada.gov. So this is the version that's published by the United States Department of Justice. This is going to be the standards in their purest form is going to be on ada.gov. And then there's also an ADA checklist for existing facilities. So this is available. It's provided by the New England ADA Center. So again, another ADA center in our national network. And this is a really useful tool for checking the compliance of your facility without having to jump back and forth between all the sections of the standard. It's just a nice clean checklist so you can kind of get a big picture of the accessibility. Again, that's provided by the New England ADA Center. And then if you want a hard copy of the standards, you can visit our online store, which again is linked in the slide notes. I can also provide these links in the chat as well. And the hard copy of the standards, again, it's available through our online store, which is rockymountainada.org. You can access our store. And so those are all the places, you can find the standards and you can learn more. You can read more about what exactly physical spaces that are accessible look like, what exactly the dimensions, the measurements, how many accessible parking spaces you need to have, how many accessible wheelchair spaces you need to have if you provide seating for, musicals or plays or any kind of show. You can find it all in the standards. You can think of these ADA accessibility standards as kind of the handbook for the minimum requirements of physical accessibility. You can find them online, or again, you can order a hard copy through our store. And if you have any trouble interpreting them, if you have any trouble accessing them online, again, you can give us a call. Our number is 1-800-949-4232. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation here. Now, if you're able to access the slides, which are posted, and Ria, I'll turn it over to you to give us more information on exactly where they're posted. But the rest of these slides kind of go through questions that you can ask to figure out if you're meeting kind of those minimum accessibility requirements. Again, the slides don't go through every single requirement because it would be a 500 slide PowerPoint if it did, but it asks, the rest of the slides ask questions like, do my restrooms have grab bars? Do my accessible parking spots have adjacent access aisles so people can load and unload their mobility devices? Are there queues for people who may not be able to stand in long lines? Are we able to provide service animal relief areas if people aren't able to easily, go outside in front of our venue or facility so that their service animal can relieve themselves? Can we have a service animal relief area in our venue? Questions like that. So again, you can find those in the subsequent slide notes.